You are trying to hit milestones and you are trying to de-risk your technology and de-risk your company. So what I want to be really clear on is if you think that you are going to do pure proof of concept work, or you're doing very early stage research, these are things that are really hard to get funded outside of an academic lab. So I would suggest that you stay with academic funding when you're doing the pure research. A company really starts when you've run out of academic funding and you're ready to move from a research idea or a breadboard into a real product. So that's just a good way to think about it. It is very hard to get early stage funding for things like capital equipment. So that's why it's really good to be working with your academic lab or working in a place that can provide that, because it's super hard to get pure capital equipment funded. Just tough, trust me on that. So the real thing that you want to think about with funding is always think about when you're going to run out of cash. So startups live and die on their own. It is not like a university. You cannot get major loans. You cannot get financing from the state. You basically have a certain amount of money in your piggy bank. When you run out of money, you lay people off, you shutter the place, and you might or might not be able to sell off your assets. So always be thinking in terms of, I've got a certain amount of cash. What are the milestones I need to hit? What are the product and company items that have to be de-risked with this amount of money so that I can either start shipping product and selling, or I can bring in more investment. So always keep this in mind. A CEO of a small company may have a PhD, but they are spending an unbelievable amount of their time fundraising. So it's a very different role. So what are the sources of startup funds? Two different main ones, dilutive funding and non-dilutive funding. So starting with non-dilutive, this is what everybody likes, right? This is funding where you do not have to give anyone equity or stock in your company. So you get to keep your ownership because somebody is just giving you money. And there are a bunch of these, but we will give you this information again. So on non-dilutive funding, SBIRs are really common. We'll talk more about that. Revenue is the #1 way to fund yourself. Make a product and ship it. Foundations do have some amount of prize money. Industry partnerships can be a wonderful way to bring money in if it's a win-win situation. Remember that they will probably want some amount of your intellectual property, or they will want an exclusive license in some way. So it's trickier than it sounds, and it's going to take a lot of negotiation. Pitch competitions are good for a relatively small amount of money. But we did have a team go to Y Combinator's last year, and they ended up closing on $3 million. I will say that that was equity money though. So usually pitch competitions are much, much smaller for a grant. Advanced industries is money that's available from the state of Colorado. That's coming, our money from the state of Colorado is used for the Lab Venture Challenge, where people can win $125,000 to work on their company. Crowdfunding is a way to go. We're not going to talk about it much today, but it's certainly an option. And bank loans. Loans are almost always cheaper than equity over time, but do be a little bit careful, because venture debt sounds like a loan, but it's actually a loan plus venture capital. So they want warrants, which is part of your equity. So that's a tricky term. So that's the non-dilutive side of how you can get funded. I'm going to talk a little bit more about SBIRs, and I'm just going to say a couple of big picture things. There's a reason for this. We are having an entire conference done virtually at lunchtime in January on SBIRs. So you are very welcome to join us in January, where we will do much more of a deep dive on these. But remember that SBIR is basically, you write a huge proposal for phase 1, which can take up to 6 months or more to get funded, and then give you $150,000. You can then apply to the federal government for phase 2, which they range vastly in how much money is available in phase 2, somewhere between 300,000 and more than $1 million, depending. And then phase 3 is really where they try to support you, but you are commercializing this on your own. There are 11 different federal agencies. Again, you don't have to write this down. We'll give you the slides. But we usually see people applying to the Department of Defense, the Department of Energy, NIH is health, and NASA a little bit, NSF. So on that note, in case you're confused about SBIR, the great news is that we now have a new center on campus to help you through this. So can we have Jacob Siegel? Hi, Jacob. It's great to see you. I see your face. Jacob, can you give us just a very brief overview of what do you all do and how do you help people through this process?
Yes, of course. Thanks for having me. Glad to be here. So we've started this new Center for Translational Research on our campus about 6 months ago. This is now a resource to all faculty, all researchers, all students on our campus who are seeking non-dilutive funding for their startup companies. The whole goal of our center is to help navigate that process so we can help find the best solicitations, the best mechanisms for your technology across those agencies that Sally was just describing. Then we can help write those proposals with you. We have a proposal writer on staff who can help with the drafting, the editing, the clarity of your writing. We also have market research specialists out of the Leeds School of Business. So these are MBA level economists and market research specialists who can dive into your industry and figure out where your technology lies within that landscape, try to highlight all the differentiating factors, try to pull statistics on the industry, the market size, all these competitors, the pricing, all those things. And in result, we hope to submit more proposals to these SBIR and STTR mechanisms. We hope to win more proposals, and we hope to seed your technologies, your companies, as well as fund research in our university laboratories. If you want to get a hold of us, just check out our website, as well as my email is provided, and we're happy to engage whenever you like.
Fantastic, Jacob. So we have a number of teams that are already working with Jacob and his team, and the feedback's been really good. So if you do want to go after SBIR money, it is one of the most popular ways to go with non-dilutive funding. Definitely, I'd recommend reaching out to Jacob. And again, we'll share these slides. So jumping back in, I want to talk one more minute about that whole question of revenue and making sure people understand this term bootstrapping. So bootstrapping is where you put in a little bit of your own money, you go as far as you can, you scrape together a little more money, you get to product, you sell that product, and then you begin making enough money to self-fund yourself. And I'm not going to go into huge detail on that today, but I'm going to say that you should really think hard about bootstrapping. First, this is the mentality of most entrepreneurs. And you think really scrappily about how do you take the money you have and use it to best effect, because you never have quite enough and you're always working harder than you think. So how do I bootstrap to more quickly get to product? Okay, so I'm going to turn now to equity funding. And equity funding is back on the dilutive side of the equation. So when you sell shares in your company, that is part of the equity of the company, and an angel investor or a venture capitalist will give you money. Give you money, you give them shares of the company. So that's what equity funding is. This picture, which you're going to be staring at very, very quickly, but the point of it is across the top, you start with an idea and you move through de-risking that idea to where you actually get a product that you can then get validation from the market that somebody actually likes it. Once you get that traction, then you can start scaling your product. So this does work a little bit differently in biotech, and we've got Mark Lupa on the panel today to talk about it from a biotech perspective. But what I want to point out is at the very beginning, it's very hard to get anybody to want to fund your brilliant idea on the whiteboard. So as you start moving toward having a proof of concept, a beta that somebody actually likes, and then a first paying customer, these things significantly de-risk your early stage company. And you get much more capital who is interested in investing in you. Usually very early on, that's angels. So it's friends, family, early stage, wealthy people in your community who are willing to support you to push you to the next level of de-risking and hopefully traction. From there, you move into early VC, which can be hard to find. There's kind of a paucity of that in deep tech. From there, you can move into larger venture capital funds and then into private equity, finally into the public markets. So at the same time that there is all of this equity available, as you go and grow, you're able to get bank loans. But understand that at the very beginning, banks do not want to bank you. So the common joke is that you can borrow money when you no longer need it. So, you know, you have to prove to the bank that you are fully capable of paying it back before they want to loan you money. So again, this goes back to just the question of why are you funding? And that's because early stage, you're not making money. You're not selling a product and you're spending a lot of money. You're trying to get your amazing technology into a real product, or you're trying to get it licensed to a very large company like a Merck who will take it forward for you. And all of this time you're spending money on the people and the lab space and everything else you need. That's one definition of the valley of death. And that's what you're trying to get funded. So how do you find an angel? They sound like great people. Well, there's a lot of different places. We will give you the slides, but you know, Angel List, PitchBook, CB Insights, these are all services that are available online. There's also a lot of local networks. So Rocky's Venture Club is a really good example. Another one is Susan Strong, who is our own super connector. Susan runs Sage Advisors, and she also connects people through Innosphere. So there are a lot of local places that you can look. You can also talk to your vendors that you've hired, such as your attorney, a fractional CFO. Talk to us, that's CU Venture Partners. But it's really important to understand that the way that these things work is a warm introduction. So I would not advise you to apply online. Without that personal connection, it's very hard to get traction with any of these people. Okay, so once you know that you want to work with angel capital, what's going to happen? So I'm going to take as the example Rocky's Venture Club, just as an example, since we were just mentioning them. You'll file an application with them, you'll get to know them. They go through a pitching or a vetting process to make sure you're ready. You typically need to do a hyper accelerator with them or a program with us. If you get selected, you pitch for them and a bunch of angels in the room. And then from there, they decide if they're interested. So the interest is really great. On the one hand, they say, yeah, we loved it. It was a great idea. On the other, they jump into something called due diligence. And that is trying to get through everything that they can find of reasons why they should not invest. So they're going to really deep dive into everything. And you need to have yourself put together. You need to be in order before going through due diligence. I have definitely seen teams fail because they did not have an organized approach to due diligence. If they like you after that, they will offer you a term sheet. and a first look at a cap table, and that's a negotiation. So we can talk to you much more about term sheets. You'll try to end up out of that with a lead investor. It could be a Rockies Venture Club syndicate or somebody else, but you're putting together a coalition of people to fund you. After all of that, you finally close a deal. So this is part of why I'm telling you up front that a CEO of your own startup is spending almost all their time on the money side of the business. Somebody else is in the lab. So a checklist to raise capital, we think you're going to need to have a product market fit. Tune in for every one of our programs if you want to talk more about product market fit. That's the key to what we do. The team is also equally important. Having the right people on the bus is just a super important thing. It's what they look for. Is this a team that can pivot? Because your first product market fit is likely wrong. So how do you get this right? You'll need to incorporate with an attorney. You'll need to have financial pro formas with a financial person to help you with that. We have services that can help you. You'll need to find an attorney, cap table, ownership. You're going to need to figure out all the ownership up front, which is a challenging conversation. Finally, I'm going to say that on this checklist to raise capital, the biggest one is not there. Your traction with the market is one of the most important things they will look at. So, you know, how cool is your innovation, but how likely are people to actually buy it? So again, going back to, if you can have somebody who is already buying it, that is the best reason that people will invest, is that early traction. So picture of a term sheet, we will help you through that. Remember, investors, it's the average length of time that you work with a single investor once they join your company at the seed round is longer than the average American marriage. So make sure you like the people you're going to work with. Make sure you trust them and make sure you can work with them. This is going to be really, really important because you will absolutely run into hurdles and struggles in a small business, and you want somebody who will work with you rather than against you. So, okay, with that overview, you've now got the very basics of dilutive and non-dilutive funding and the ways that you can get funded. And now I'm going to bring in an all-star panel for Roundtable just to talk about how they did this and how they think about getting funded. So again, this is Hunter Albright, Alice Havel, and Mark Lupa. And instead of me continuing to blather on, I'm going to get them to introduce themselves. So Hunter, I'm going to get you to go first, but here's the deal. Can you give us a couple of minutes just on who you are, but what kind of companies, what kind of fundraising have you done? What's been your role in the funding process? So tell us a little bit about your experience.
No, I'd be happy to, Sally. So first of all, thank you for having me, and excited to be a part of the Roundtable. My background is I started my first company when I was in academia, as I was doing sort of my PhD, and sort of went through a lot of the struggles about how to sort of convert academic research into a company, both in terms of bridging, sort of finding the first customers, and getting sort of traction. So have experience going down the SBIR, the STR route, sort of the non-dilutive side. But that sort of got me hooked. And since then I have spent my career doing sort of launching new companies for larger businesses or doing startups in a variety of sort of the food industry, for renewable energy, as well as, and then my focus has been largely analytics in the retail banking and sort of financing. And so I've been mostly on sort of the CEO, sort of raising fund side, but today run a studio where we are helping launch new businesses. And then I teach within the business school. So helping to provide some guidance and support there.
Awesome. Okay, I'm overwhelmed. That was very so thanks so much, Hunter. Alice, tell us about yourself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Alice Havel. I started in clean tech about a decade ago. I have a chemical engineering material science undergrad, so I was more in the technical research, and then over time moved into technology commercialization, and then eventually went into more of the leadership side of startups. So as a COO role for a Colorado clean tech company. So I've been through the full process of providing the technical information for due diligence to investors, to babysitting their children to keep them happy, all the way to being the person pitching and sourcing capital for an investment company, from an investment company for a startup. And now I am with an investment company. I'm with the Colorado Impact Fund. So using my experience in the clean tech as well as community startups to be able to help a Colorado investment company invest in Colorado companies to grow the impact in the state. So I've worked with grant funding, equity funding, debt funding, and now provide funding.
Wonderful. Thanks, Alice. So Hunter and Alice are both from the clean tech side of things. So I've asked Mark Lupa to join us today because he's from the life sciences and biotech. So Mark, can you kindly introduce yourself?
Yes, thanks, Sally. So there's a big echo somewhere. That's sort of odd, but I'll just keep talking.
Yeah, we don't
hey,
hear it. You
everybody.
sound good to us.
My background is originally, I was a biomedical engineer. I did a master's in bioengineering and a PhD in pharmacology, which I used to do medical research for about 15 years. Last place was at the Health Science Center here in Colorado. At that point, it was time for me to get an academic position. I had some opportunities around the country, but my wife and I decided that we did not want to leave Colorado. So I took the next logical step in my career and opened a microbrewery. This was in 1993, and we were, I believe, the 8th brewery started in the state. And that's how I got into business. And I learned everything the hard way. You know, I started off as just a founder, a brewer, quality control guy. First, I became the CFO and taught myself accounting and raised all the capital for the business, and ended up being the CEO and merged that company, that brewery, which was Tabernash Brewing, with Left Hand Brewing. And I remain on the board of Left Hand still. After that, I got into the investment world then, first with a private investment group in Boulder called Tango, and the last 15 years been a managing partner at High Country Venture, which has managed 2 small venture funds that have invested in early stage companies in Colorado in the tech and life science areas. So I've worked as a scientist, worked in a lab. I've been an entrepreneur, started at least more than one company, and the last 15 years, really, I've been an investor. So that's me.
Fantastic. And I will just point out for everybody that it's great to have Alice in the room from the Colorado Impact Fund. Mark and I are both very involved in the new Buff Fund that we're putting together for investing startups such as yourselves coming out of CU. So you're seeing it from both sides, both the entrepreneurs and the funders today. So, okay, Roundtable, I'm going to start this off with a really hard question, but I can't think where else to go. Which, you know, when you think about a pitch, a high-tech pitch, what pitch resonates with you when you've got, you know, a difficult tech with a long path to market? What do you think really resonates and gets people to bite?
This is a hard question. I think I would start with, if it's pretty obvious if somebody doesn't really know their market. If a PhD stands in front of me to present their technology, I'm going to guess you know your technology. And in the time that we have for a pitch, we can certainly come back another time and talk more about the depth of the technology to make sure that there's validity there. And as an engineer, you know, I'll be able to pick up on a few things to begin with. But it's really obvious if you don't understand who you're selling to and what kind of market you're selling into. And I think that's what I'm always looking for to see, do you understand who's going to be buying?
That's a great one. Hunter, Mark?
And I'd pick up on what Alice had said. I think one of the key things for me that I would look at is, first of all, there's for me, for where there's a gap on the technology, I always think about it, passion as well as potential. So one is, given the level of risk, is there a big enough potential where people are going to have the appetite to sort of stay the course over that longer period of time? And then equally, is there the passion that people want or willing to solve the hard problems that will come up? So I currently do a lot of stuff in the blockchain space. That's an area where there's a lot of passion for the potential and bigger outcomes, but a lot of uncertainty. And so a lot of the things that we look at there is, how do we change the uncertainty into known risk? So picking up on what Alice is saying, who are the likely customers, why would they want it, and how do we sort of prove traction along the way? And then the other key element for me is there the potential for multiple off-ramps? So even if the full vision doesn't come true, do people know other opportunities to monetize the efforts so that some investment, there's a way of monetizing or getting value out of the investment?
So I agree with Hunter and Alice on all those points. Life science is slightly different, of course, because you're further away from a product. As far as pitches go, I think there's two things for us. What I look at is being concise and able to tell your story simply, and because I think if it takes someone 10 minutes to explain what their technology does and why the market needs it, it's hard for anyone else to understand. So being very concise in your story and being able to really get to the point is an important thing. And then the second part is how people answer questions, because that often really tells me a lot about who I'm working with. There are different ways that people answer questions. Some will answer defensively, and that's something you certainly want to look out for, because there are always questions that come up. And I think what you're looking for is scientific answers, which are not always black and white, right? Science is not always black and white. You don't know where you're going to end up with this drug or your medical device. This is what we believe. And so having somebody answer questions well gives you insight into how that person will work over time, and whether they'll be easier to work with or not, and how successful they'll be. Because I think the smartest people really know that they don't know everything about everything. So that's something that we always look for as well.
Interesting. Okay. So turning this again, in both clean tech and life sciences, how early can you look for investment? So, proof of concept, I need $15 million to run a pilot, or I need traction with a customer. What are you looking for?
I'll just say briefly, at least in life science, and probably in the other technologies, you need some sort of data, right? You need some sort of convincing data. In life science, at the minimum, really, everybody's looking for animal data. In vitro data is not enough. If you have human data, that's even better. But I think once you have data, you have something to back up your story, and you can at least start looking for funding. Equity funding. You may not get it, but you can start there.
Yeah, and I think I agree with that. And I think that as soon as you start going for equity funding, as soon as you take dilutive funding, you're really committing to the business side of it, the commercialization side of it. And so you, as Mark said, you really need to know, I've got this data, and this data could lead to this story, this vision, this outcome. And so the more data, as he's saying, that you can collect on your technology platform, whether it's a service or a product, the better you'll be able at crafting the full story, which includes the growth of the company, the finances you need to grow that company, the market that you'll eventually sell into, the way you're going to attract that. And once you start to pull that story, even if you haven't achieved it, pulling that story together does need that data at the beginning.
Hunter, would you agree? Would you say state it differently?
Yeah, no, I would agree with the collecting of the data. And the one thing I would say is I think there's data to collecting on sort of the market need, and so trying to sort of pull out those trends, a little bit what Alice was saying about telling that holistic story. And the other thing early in this process, especially as you start to have data that I would say proves the feasibility of the solution, start to go then have conversations with potential customers of, hey, if we build this, would you buy this? And I think more of those, the more conversations like that you can have earlier on, one, you get a sense for people's appetite for it, but I also think you cultivate potential partnerships in which they may help you with early revenue as you then get closer to prototyping or even piloting an early solution. So it may help both accelerate your ability to raise venture capital, but also supplement it by having revenue early on in the process with different approaches.
Okay, so let me, I'd love to be specific about this, and Hunter in particular, if you've got, or actually Bartega, Alice, but okay, so if you've got like a car battery, I'm going to make car batteries better in some way. How far along do you typically need to be before an investor is even interested? You know, do you need to have a contract with an OEM, or do you need to have a working battery? Do you need to have, you know, what kind of validation proves that you are ready to move forward as a company?
You know, one of the things I think is challenging with that question is that each level of funding is going to require a different level of information. So if we take it right back, if you've been doing, let's say, a PhD or a master's degree, and the research comes out and suggests there could be a market opportunity, it's possible that you could get funding out of that if there's just this idea that suggests there's a place to go. But at that point, there's other avenues that don't require equity funding, so investment money, that allows you to take it to another step. So I've done it in a beaker in the lab. How do I show that I could do it 10 times over, or I can continuously make whatever that is, if it's, say, a compound polymer for some application in space. And so it's understanding where you're at and relating that to the funding that you have. My general feeling is that the country has great non-dilutive grant funding to take you to the point where you can say, I can make this product with a decent amount of repeatability. And during this process, I've talked to these 15 companies that have all said, yes, this is very interesting, and here's 7 metrics that we would need for you to show us to buy it, and here's how it would disrupt it. And as you get to that stage, you can start to step out of the grant funding and more into the equity funding opportunity. We hear these stories of investment into this grand idea and it exploded. It's not as common as you think, because you want to have that knowledge that you've at least got a plate of an opportunity here. There's some pieces of the puzzle that you can start piecing together before you bring in equity funding. And the thing about equity funding is you've now got another seat at the table. You've got another voice. So if you're not clear of where it's going, someone else will come in and tell you exactly where to take it.
So true. Hunter.
No, I agree with that. I think you need to know what you're going to use the money for, and that you need to have a real purpose for what you're going to be using it to prove out, depending at the stage. Give a specific example. So I was at Tendril, which is sort of a local sort of clean tech, and one of the things is we were further along with both some software products that we were doing, but we really then at that point partnered with customers and negotiated contracts with them to be early users of it, both fund some of the R&D that was part of it. So it was a more efficient way for them to do their R&D. We gave them rights. We gave them sort of look into what was working, what wasn't working. So there was value for them, even if it didn't come off the way we had wanted it to, because they were getting the learning. So there was an off-ramp, there was a byproduct that they were happy to get access to. And then we continued to partner with them as we rolled it out. So we would get feedback directly from their customers, which were sort of the end users, and then would use that as a way to refine the product. So once we had known there was a need, and then we had proven the technical feasibility, we then moved into sort of viability, use of funds for proving out viability, and did that in partnership with customers.
Interesting. So Hunter, was Tendril funded in order to be an R&D company for other people?
Well, Tendril went through many different stages, but it wasn't funded to, I think, do that. It was part of the pivoting and the journey in terms of being creative about how we could leverage funding from multiple sources to sort of stay alive and be adding value as we went through the process. So I would say there were times of creative strategy in terms of how we were trying to line up assets and opportunities to be able to develop and keep the business going forward.
Right.
It sounds like entrepreneurship. I've heard people in their more cynical times define entrepreneurship as doing whatever it takes to stay alive till the next funding round, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But sometimes it turns out really well, right? You get in those difficult spots, and it sounds like Tendril ended up with a really good strategy and a great commercialization plan.
Well, it gave you a way to stay connected to customers and to be listening to the customer voice so you could figure out what you did want to do when the first idea doesn't work.
Yeah, and to be fair, and one of the things that sort of Tendril had run into early on is Tendril was led astray by actually customers early on. So there was the period where early on, in terms of some of the clean tech hardware development that's sort of under legislation that Obama had supported, there was money for all of the companies to be doing work and making investments in terms of R&D and hard tech or hardware. But it dried up. They had no real interest in then paying for it. They were doing it because of the grant money. And so that was one of the things that sort of put Tendril into a bit of a cul-de-sac in terms of pursuing some funding. So I do think some of the topics that have come up, you need to be sort of well aware of where you want to get to longer term, because I do think you can be led astray both by some grant funding and some earlier customers. And so you just need to be aware of that and sort of cautious of certain circumstances.
I've certainly lived that. I think that's a great, and again, talking to Jacob Siegel and others on the perspective that SBIRs can be a wild distraction. You get 3 of them in 3 different directions, and all of a sudden the company is losing focus as it's trying to just execute on grants. So Mark, would you have a different perspective or same perspective in life sciences?
Sally, unfortunately, I didn't hear the question. You sort of broke up. And so I was trying to make out what the question was. What are we discussing?
Oh, no. Well, we're talking about the basic idea of
how far along you have to be with your product. Is that what I heard?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean,
Sure.
yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, in life science, it's not any different in life science in one way, in that you want to be as far along as you can, obviously. And I always try to counsel people that come to me. The first thing I ask is, what grants have you applied for? And just apply for as many grants as you can. Usually the answer is, well, that takes 6 to 9 months to get that money. And my answer is, it's going to take longer to get venture capital. And so start with the grants. But I do think once you have data, it really pays to go and talk to some corporate people, whether they're corporate VCs or whether they're corporate business development people, to find out what the corporate biotechs and corporate medical device companies are thinking about this area. You should understand the area well enough to know what sort of competition there is, but getting that idea. And then in those discussions, you sort of lay the groundwork for later discussions. Once you get some traction, you can go back to them. I think, again, I personally, I think the dividing line between getting real equity investments as opposed to just, friends and family would be the animal data, whether it's a medical device or biotechnology or a diagnostic. Some animal data is usually what it takes to get venture investors or large wealthy angel investors really interested.
Mark said something really important there, and I would reiterate that: be wary of fast cash. If the money is pretty quick to come in, I would have a red flag up. Whether it's grant funding, whether it's even angel investing, venture capital in my case, there's a process, and there should be, because the investor shouldn't go in blind, whoever it is, whether it's the SBIR program or the venture capital. If a check comes in too quickly, I'd be very concerned.
Interesting. Okay, so y'all brought up competition, and I wanted to just ask a little bit more about that. You know, competition to me is validating that there actually is a market, but how important is it to understand what the competition is in academia and in industry?
I think competition is validating to a market for sure. What you're hoping to show is why you belong as part of the ecosystem. What gap are you filling? When I worked in biotechnology for biofuels and biochemicals, there's going to be a lot of players in that market, simply because we're replacing the oil and gas sector, which is enormous. We're trying to overhaul it, so it's going to take a lot of players. So you're trying to show where your niche is, why your feedstock is important, why the final product that you're making and the purity you're making and the partnerships you're creating to make the end product has a place in the market. So it's really about showing how your seat at the table with the other competitors in this market fit, and how you're protecting your space. What would it take for someone to step in? What would it take for someone to make something that's not the same, but it's a substitute? And what would it take for that whole market just to disappear? You know, we've gone through ebbs and flows of various industries where things which were hot become obsolete. So it's just showing why you deserve that seat at the table.
Interesting.
I'll agree very quickly, because exactly what Alice said pertains to the biotech and medical device industry. You prefer an open market, you prefer a huge unmet need, something that is a real need. But if there's a market and you have a differentiating point and you can explain that and the corporate people understand it, then you have a market anyway.
Hunter, what do you usually pitch?
So, well, I mean, I agree with the points that have been made, that the competition is reinforcing of the market, which is really good for me. Then I tend to look for things and try to emphasize being different over being better, because I've found sort of, I think you have the ability to have better margins if you are, you know, sort of really carving out a unique niche, and so that you can stand apart, as Alice was talking about, within the market. I also think that helps with the marketing, which then becomes a key element of how can you simply sort of communicate the benefits or the change you're helping people make in a language that is starting to get away from, I think I fell into this trap earlier on, like being too excited about the how in a technology or sort of a scientific business, and not spending enough time on simplifying sort of the benefits of the change, and sort of actually more of the emotive elements as opposed to the rational elements in that pitch. And so I think if you get to a place where you're different and you get that messaging, then you can hopefully be able to have a higher margins that help sort of sustain the business. And, you know, I'm a big believer that sort of go for the highest priced product out of the gate, because selling a few of those give you a longer runway, give you more opportunity to survive mistakes than trying to compete on sort of a commodity or a lower cost business straight out of the gate.
I want to say something that always brings a red flag to me is if anyone comes saying the lowest cost product. So if you are coming in, reducing cost is fine if it comes with a differentiated, in many people on this call's case, the technology. So if it does these things, and by the result of that, it does reduce the cost, that's okay. But if you're coming in to say, I'm going to compete with Mitsubishi on this product, or I'm going to compete with a DuPont on this material, and I'm going to be lower cost, that's a very, very short window for a differentiating factor. These companies have huge scales of economy. They have buying power. So be mindful if an investor gives you a blank look when you say, we are going to be the lowest cost. That's why.
Yeah, venture investors don't invest in the lower cost items. Venture investors invest in new innovations, which generally cost more. They come out of the gate costing more. And once they scale up to hit the general population, then the price starts coming down. It's like computers, right? Computers a long time ago. I mean, remember when computers cost $2,000 or $3,000 or more a piece? Now you can get them for $500.
Yeah, it's so true. And another question that may be helpful to ask yourself is, what would it take, and if I use my DuPont example, for DuPont in money and time and resources to do what I've just done? With enough resources, time and people, you can invent what you've all likely invented. But the time aspect and the cost is really important. So if you've developed a novel polymer that's able to do moisture barrier for certain applications, if DuPont could throw $2 million in 6 months at it, you're going to struggle to get it to market, because it's exactly what they'll do. If they have to throw $30 million and 5 years at it, that's a great barrier. So thinking of it in the context of what would it take for my big competitor or an incumbent to come in and do what I do is a nice way to think about what is my protections at my seat at the table in this market.
So I want to turn that, because I hear this a whole lot of, well, listen, my innovation is absolutely unique. Nobody's thought of it. And there isn't really a market for it today, but when people see what I can do, they will want it, and I'll create my own market. What do you think of that pitch?
Well, I'd love it if it worked. I'm still yet to meet somebody that has actually done that. And it's a red flag, because it means that the I'll build it and they will come scenario means they've really done the homework and the market research. So that's the challenge that comes up for us.
Connor, have you heard that one?
Yeah, I mean, you hear it. I would agree with Alice says. I think, right. I think everybody, it's expensive to develop technology, and it's even more expensive to change behavior. So, pick the one that you want to focus on, and generally it's better to go where people are already at in terms of the needs that they have. They may not, your solution may be new. So I think for me, that's, if there's validation, and we go back to, is there data, is there trends where there's a need and there's people spending money already, because it's also hard to get people to change the way they spend money. So try to find that area where you might have a new novel way of a solution that brings some different sort of elements, advantages, potential to the table, but in a way that you're able to just help people reallocate funds that they already have for needs or problems that they're already trying to solve.
And I will say this, I think one of the areas that technology startups do not focus on and pay for it is marketing, is business development, it is sales. And it's often thought by technical specialists that these are fluffy areas of the company. They're so critical. The strategic selling skill is rare, and it's really hard to get right. The sooner you start getting your head around strategic selling and understanding that, the more successful that you'll be. It is really hard to sell into enterprises. It's really hard to sell into businesses, and it requires diligence, strategy, and the ability to balance multiple things at once. And the sooner you realize that you need someone specialized at that, the sooner your company will start to take on legs of an actual company with potentials of success.
That's excellent. So I'm going to ask one more question and then open up the floor for anybody who's got questions. You're pointing about team. So can you just talk a little bit about how important is team for getting funded and for actually moving forward, or what do you need team for?
Culture trumps strategy any day. You might have a great technology. You're going to have to pivot. It's never going to be done right the first time. And your team forms the culture, and the culture is what the company is anchored on.
Yeah, I would completely agree. I mean, people you're going to go in, your numbers are going to be wrong, your market's going to be wrong, your product's going to be wrong when you make your first pitch. So they're hiring the enthusiasm, they're hiring the passion, they're hiring the mental and technical competency, and they're hiring the logic for how you're thinking about the elements that have come up, right? I mean, because then I think people see a team that they can work with, and they can problem solve together, as opposed to somebody that has already fallen in love with the technology or the product and will be hard to help along the way.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. Investors, they, in the end, they look at the data, and the data they have to check the boxes on the data and understanding the technology and that the market is open. But in the end, the bottom check mark goes with the team. How do I feel about this team? And that comes across in how that team works together in the presentation room, how they answer questions, as I mentioned before, and how their skills and their experiences complement each other. So it's hard to get a good team together. I mean, especially at an early stage. Usually you're a scientist, and if you can get one good business person to work with you, that's great. So it's really hard to get there, but it is very important.
And just to build on that, and Sally, and pick up on something you had said earlier, I think the team should be equally as discerning of the investors as the investors are of the entrepreneurial teams. And that, I think you brought up the point, right? You're creating a partnership that's going to last for a long period of time. So work with people that you feel like you respect, that you trust, that you want to sort of go through good times and bad times with. And I would encourage people to make sure you interview the CEOs of businesses that other investors have funded, to sort of know how they react when things go south. Because again, I think as a CEO, as a leadership team, you need to be as discerning as the investor is in terms of who they pick.
So I agree with you, Hunter. I certainly agree in that the CEOs should do their research on the investors. Unfortunately, as we know, as an entrepreneur, you rarely have a whole lot of decisions. I mean, if you can get one group to give you a pile of money, that's pretty good. And so I think part of the other way to deal with it is do your research, understand who you're working with. And it takes a matter of some amount of skill, interpersonal skill, business IQ, to figure out, how do I work with this group? What do I need to provide? A lot of hand-holding. Some of them need, written reports. Some of them, you need to understand who your investors are as well, so that you can make that relationship work as well as you can.
I think that is spot on. I have always loved the advice to be choosy about who you work with. And at the same time, when you're brand new, there's maybe one person who is going to work with you. So, finding that person and then figuring out how to make it work is vital. So, hey, Colin, you got a question from the chat?
No, I have some questions, but I did want to just give a shout out. We have about 2 minutes left. I wanted to make sure we mentioned there's a funding series in December, partnership with Innosphere. So if you're interested in all these topics, we'll have deeper dives into how do you actually approach investors? What does that pitch look like? I was curious, how do you all look at, reinvesting in a company? Because now you've got an emotional tie. There's a lot of other things going on there.
Yeah, I think it's important to know that when you're investing, that not every company is going to take off. And so it's important to, when you reinvest, you're really looking at it from the same lens as you did the first time round. You just have more data, right? So you've watched the company perform, you've watched the company grow. I think there's this misconception that if you're not doing great, they're not going to reinvest. It's not true. Markets shift, things change, and you've had to pivot. What they're looking for is that honesty within the team that says the market shift, we need to shift. The ability to move rapid with those shifts, so to be able to pivot and move together. And then the ability to share that information to the investment group and say, here's what we're doing, and getting feedback. If there's this working relationship and you are listening to the various sources of information in terms of the market, product shift, and shifting with it, that's more of a positive sign than they're doing really great, but there's this underlying worry that we're about to fall off a cliff because no one's listening to this upcoming market, or there's tension in the team because they haven't figured out how to work together.
Any other follow-up on that? Okay.
I would agree with Alice. Once you make a first investment, you're most likely going to make a second and probably a third, but you certainly, I mean, as an investor, you should take all emotions out of it. You never can because we're human. But you do want to continually reevaluate the company, where it's at, where it should go. Are these the right people in place? Do we have the right strategy? And so it gets back to really having a management team and a board of directors, really, which is your main investor group, that can work together. That's how you make successful companies.
Yeah, and that's just such a great point. VCs will want control. Once they put their money in, they're placing a bet, and they want to be a part of your team. You will be actively managing them. It's a lot of time. On the one hand, they can really open up their network and maybe bring you some key partnerships, some really amazing connections, and they can provide incredible advice. And on the other, you're going to be managing them. It's a huge time suck to have investors, and just you need to allocate your time that you're fundraising, you're dealing with your current VCs, you're trying to get a product out the door.
One of the challenges when companies come into VC funding is that you are going to grow rapidly. You probably have. And the disconnect that can happen is that this pace of growth of the founder as the CEO to keep up with the growth of the company, it's almost impossible many times to have that happen. A lot of cases, a new CEO or at least a president will have to come in to help because that growth is so fast. And the ability to understand why that's happening and to work with what needs to happen rather than I need to stay in the CEO role, it's an important thought process to go through. It's really hard because most people want to continue right through to the end, but it's a very challenging position to be in. And I've met very few companies where the CEO who started as the technical designer has stayed with the company as the CEO all the way to an exit.
Very true. So, okay, on that note, it's 1 minute after 1, so I'm going to call it, but I want to first of all say thank you so much to our roundtable. People who are in the Q&A, stay on for just a second. I think we can get your questions answered if you'd like to stay just a couple of minutes. And for everybody, please remember that we're doing a 4-pack of Lunch and Learns in December. That's going to be on angel investing and how to do it. And then another really great week of lunchtime stuff in January on SBIRS. So you'll see all of that in our emails, on our email list, and also on our website. So lots more deep dive from this roundtable. So again, thank you so much to our panelists. Really appreciate it.